Margaret Thatcher has divided opinion for as long as most of us can remember. Born on the 13th of October 1925, 100 years ago today, she is either celebrated as the saviour of Britain or condemned for turning us into an island of selfish profit-seekers indifferent to the common good or the dignity of work. I am joined by two learned men who hold passionately opposing views of the matter. Lord Charles Moore was a close friend and remains an ardent admirer of Mrs. Thatcher. He is also the author of the most comprehensive biography of the Iron Lady, written as a trilogy, but now available in a special single volume to celebrate Thatcher's centenary. William Clouston is one of the most erudite politicians in the country. He is the leader of the Social Democrat Party, campaigned in elections for the SDP against Thatcher's government throughout the 1980s, and remains to this day a thoughtful critic from both the right and the left of what he views as her callous, excessively global free market fundamentalism. Charles, in 1975, inflation was running at about 27% in Britain. When Thatcher came to power in 1979, we had chronic strikes, late trains, regular power cuts, and lower living standards than France, Italy, and Germany, despite having bestrode the world within living memory. What did Thatcher do in her 11 years in government to turn this around and restore Britain to prosperity, in your view?
The first thing she did was to kitchen sink the problem in public. So saying, this is why everything's gone wrong, and we have to start to put it right, and that is actually our task, the Conservative Party's task, not to evade it anymore. And this was chiefly to do with the things you've raised. They were mainly economic questions. It was also a very important question about the Cold War and how well defended or otherwise Britain was, and nuclear development. And she had to stage this. You couldn't do all these things at once. And so the first thing she did was to push the idea that she was going to stabilize the currency in order to reduce inflation, so monetary control, and also open Britain for business, hence the abolition of exchange controls. Mm-hmm. And with trade unions, she was going to change the law so that trade union leaders could not exercise illegitimate power over trade union members. And that she did by stages, partly because she was opposed to some extent by her Employment Secretary Jim Pryor, but mainly because she knew from the mistakes that Ted Heath had made that you shouldn't invoke the criminal law here. You should change civil law so that you return rights to members and you open up the trade unions who are behaving badly to civil suits. And that she did, and that's why it was so important. It's the first volume of my original full biography. Is called Not for Turning. And that's what she was really talking about then, because it was so important for her to say, we are not going to do a U-turn. The full phrase that produced Not for Turning was U-turn, if you like, sort of pun. The ladies not for turning. And she said that because the Heath government in which she served had U-turned.
On prices and incomes, wasn't it?
Yes, on a price and incomes policy. And therefore effectively on everything to do with inflation and to do with the trade unions. And so she said that in dark days, and she had to give, apart from anything else, she had to give a signal to the gilts market because they always expected a British government of either party to U-turn. And so it was overwhelmingly important for her if she was going to be able to maintain, to service the government debt and get on with what she wanted to do. She had to have sort of permission by showing that she meant it. So that was really what she was on about to start with. And indeed, to some extent, all the time. I'll just round off that point by saying, she was always accused of being divisive, and she was in certain respects, but she did bring the harmony she promised in the famous quotation from St. Francis of Assisi, though actually it wasn't St. Francis of Assisi, about bringing harmony in this respect, that when she came into office, there were over 29 million working days lost to strikes in 1979. And when she left office in 1990, there were about 1.6 million working days. So there's an absolute transformation of the workplace environment in favour of working rather than, as she called it, shirking.
So she smashed the power, politicized unions, raised productivity, created jobs. Do you acknowledge these triumphs at all, William, or do you simply think that they were won at too high a price?
Not the productivity point. I don't accept that, but I think 79 was a threshold in our political life. And as Charles said, perhaps the biggest thing, the broadest thing, was that you had a conviction politician that actually believed that the country could succeed and had to go against this narrative of decline. So that culturally, that was very important. And on the credit debit side, I would definitely put that down as a credit. And likewise, I think you only have to look at the 1970s on the record in the data to know that we had a very, very particular problem with radical trade unionism and strikes. And again, on my credit side, trade union reform I would put as a credit. And actually my predecessors, David Owen said very much the same thing in the 80s. It needed to be done. And there are other broader things which are foreign policy. Cold War, the Falklands War are also credits. It's on the data, taming inflation was also a credit. But my critique of Thatcherism and Thatcher in government is much more, I try and summarize it. I was thinking about it before the interview. How would I summarize it? And it sounds trite, but I would say that she was a better retailer than a builder. That is the point. That's my observation. So she was obviously famously privatized and sold many of the national industries. Now, as someone that advocates the social market economy, I think the general goods or services should be made by the private sector in a properly competitive market that is much more efficient. But I think it was a grave error, and I think with the benefit of hindsight now, we can see it was a grave error to privatize the utilities, power generation and distribution, transmission, and water have been a failure. So those, I think, in retrospect, have been a disaster. I think housing as well. We, in our party, we look at the country as a home, not a shop. But I think the record on housing, although it was very popular, sale of council houses, right to buy is very popular. The rate of sales to new builds was 7-1, so the stock went down. And again, many years later, we have a housing crisis. And I think that is the key thing I think your viewers will be interested in as a social conservative. You see, my gripe with Thatcherism is that it was too purist in its market ideology, pushed things too far, and as a result was incompatible with the sort of social conservatism that I advocate, which has to be softer and more connected to place. I think that's my basic critique of it. So it's much easier to look at it from now and say, well, this started badly and obviously the seeds go back. But that's my basic critique, is on the material things, on trade, on industrialization and housing and energy. I think there were very big failures which we were suffering from there.
Charles?
Well, it's not, what William's saying is not totally untrue, but I think there's some important points here. One is, if you're just talking about Mrs. Thatcher personally, there was a difference between her and her government and some of this. She was very aware of the problem of privatizing monopolies without breaking them up. But the Treasury wanted to privatize them unbroken up because it wanted more money. And you mustn't let the best be the enemy of the good in politics, because you have to get on. And it's a very complicated thing to sell off great big industries. And so sometimes she gave in on this, and there were some bad effects, particularly water, I would agree. I wouldn't be so sure it's right about power generation, but and she had quite a lot of fights with the Treasury about this, and she won some of them and she lost others. But I think the overall effect of privatization, much of which was not monopolistic, or it was only monopolistic because it had been monopolized, could then change, and there were very clear benefits which no one would wish to reverse. No one sensible would wish to reverse. There's another thing which I think William is missing, because what people tend to say is, what the left tends to say is she tore the heart out of communities, as a phrase they love using. I'm just old enough to remember what it was like in quite a lot of those places of which she, quote, tore the heart out of them. And in my view, the heart had been torn out of most of them already. Because what I think had happened was that heavy industry, in most aspects of British production, was inevitably on the slide already. Not only from bad policy, though there was a lot of bad policy, but because of what was happening in the whole world and competition. And therefore, all these attempts to sort of restructure things to keep them the same by a sort of restructuring that what was called Buttskillism had done had not worked. And you had to do something else. And she had the courage to do it, even though it will become more apparent who the losers were. And of course, the losers always make more noise than the gainers. So the people who became extremely prosperous in a town like Newbury because of Vodafone, you won't hear much from them. But you will hear a lot from the people who, in a town like Corby, who lost out. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's an important fact to bear in mind. On housing, again, I think this again was a sort of a treasury issue. The Treasury wanted the money from the sales, and it didn't want to embark on an expensive new housing policy. And on that, Mrs. Thatcher didn't fully agree with him, but certainly didn't stick up enough for the importance of new build. Though what she did do, which is forgotten and made a big difference actually, was liberalising renting, so that it actually became much easier for people to rent and much less expensive, something which the government is now trying to reverse. So quite soon they're going to find that because they're, quote, protecting tenants so well, nobody will want any tenants. The council house sales was a brilliant idea politically, and also it was basically a good idea that it's a good idea in society that you can sort of graduate from one situation to another through the result of your own efforts. And that was a tremendously important thing in the lower middle class, upper working class. And you used literally to meet people, like say taxi drivers, sort of Luton car workers, who would say, Maggie Thatcher got me my house. Extraordinary thing to say of a politician, but it shows how much cut through it had. Well, what is true, and where William is right, is that the next bit hadn't been adequately thought of.
Would you like to come back on that briefly before we get into the broader issue of deindustrialisation?
Yeah, housing is very interesting. I think as a political strategy, it was wildly popular with those that bought. I mean, the discount was 25% up to 30%. So who wouldn't like to benefit from that? And yes, you could argue, and actually many families did get on the housing ladder from that. But and again, in a really broad sweep of history, it's very difficult to take even the very long administration of Mrs. Thatcher and say, well, that was the cause of it. Because actually the decline in state capacity in house buildings happened before that. I think it was 1970 was the last year that the state outbuilt the private sector with about 200,000 homes. But the model, yet again, the whole model, the Buttskill thing, the corporate model, social democracy of that type broke. And the national economy that they built post-war out of an imperial economy, and it was a new national economy, it was a marked turn against that. So one of my principal objections to this turn that happened, coincided with Mrs. Thatcher, or she's part of it, not the entire author of it, is that we lost the capacity to think as a nation state to solve problems here by direct government action. I also think it's possibly the biggest single legacy, the biggest achievement from her point of view, is the political settlement post Thatcher was entirely Thatcherite. I mean, this model had been broken, and no successive government, much to my annoyance, has ever managed to pull anything back. So all of these things is largely accepted. You have a regulator, you have foreign interests predating on your utilities. The railways are run. I mean, the joke was the Tories didn't object to the state running the railways. They just wanted the Germans and the Dutch to do it. That's the point. So and water the same, and housing the same. So I in debates because we've had very long Labour governments. We've got a Labour government now, and they've got no ambition to bring back state capacity in house building, and they will fail in their targets. They've got a target for 1.5 million homes. I promise you, they have no way of doing it because they lack the capacity to do it. So this coincided with Thatcherism. And when I debate Labour people, I point to a very interesting fact that Mrs. Thatcher built more council homes per year than New Labour did in its entirety. Did you know that?
Rather like
Incredible.
Harold Wilson closed more coal mines. So.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
But you get the gist. So I think it's a journey against state capacity and direct national intervention. And again, to go back to the social conservative point, I think, and this is a very broad point, it's been made so many times by many people, that in a sense, Mrs. Thatcher was a free trade liberal and quite a social liberal, actually, and a thoroughly modern and progressive person, actually. And the type of social conservatism that I would cherish and desire had more in common, actually, with the Attlee post-war faith-flagging family.
Yes. I don't think it's true, by the way, that she was really a full social liberal and a progressive person in the way that you're saying. I think she had very strong conservative instincts of a sort of moral kind, and also a romantic love of British history. She wasn't knowledgeable about British history, but goodness, she had strong feelings about it. Yeah. And she, I think, she was a sort of bit of a revivalist preacher, and her free market views, though genuine, were very tied in with an idea of the sort of country Britain is and how it's thrived by free trade and so on. So when she was actually doing trade negotiations, nobody could be less free market about how, it always had to be Britain, and it always battling for Britain to get this, that, and the other.
I would just enter a quick quotation here, if I may. She described free market economics more as an instrument to national renewal than as an end in itself, as it were. She described it as the British inheritance, and she said, the British inheritance is a man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. So you very much go along with the idea that she viewed free market economics not as a dogmatic doctrine so much as an instrument to national welfare.
Yes. And independence, but independence not of the atomistic individual, but of families and actually of the country, of Britain. So I think you have to sort of understand it in that sort of way. And for that reason, she was more subtle than people would think. So, for example, she did not privatize the railways, and she did not privatize the post office, and she positively refused to do both of those things. And there were sort of sentimental reasons, that historical reasons for that, and anti-monopoly reasons for that. So it is quite an interesting picture. What I think she really did, and perhaps there's a very possibly big difference with William here, is she really, really profoundly did not believe in socialism, even in moderate socialism. And so she thought it was constantly doing harm. And though she respected Attlee as a person and the sort of integrity of the project in that sense, she always thought it had done tremendous economic harm to Britain at a time when it could have revived. And when she was a young candidate, before she even won seats, when she was in the very safe Labour seat of Dartford in the 50 and 51 elections, what she's always arguing is young people like me who are, she's not quite as explicit as, but basically what she's saying, young people like me, including women like me, who are lower middle class and we want to get on, we're being held back. She's a tremendous advocate of the sort of Hayekian idea about the road to serfdom. Which way are we going to go? And we're going to go down this road to serfdom, and we are going down to this road to serfdom. And of course, trade unions were very big in her mind in that respect. And in her view, they made it impossible for collective economic action to be beneficial economic action. I think those are, that was a very fierce thing in her head.
Could you elucidate very quickly the difference between what I know you call, William, social markets and the sort of central planning that, of course, Hayek was warning about in The Road to Serfdom, and which it sounds like Thatcher feared in the 1950s?
Well, Hayek thought any sort of social democracy would route to it and would end up in the same place. That was the problem. But first, before I do, I take Charles's point entirely. Margaret Thatcher was an instinctive politician, and you get from the book, it's a wonderful book, the pragmatism. And there were lines. I mean, railways is a very good example. She was too sentimental to. But my problem is that once you start on privatizations, where will it go? And I think Major probably wanted to keep some of the heat of privatization, so they picked the wrong one. No, the social market theory is just, I think it's history's favorite child. I think, rather like a bird, it has to have two wings. You have to have, these private sector and public sector are complementary. They absolutely need each other. I've never argued for a large state, but you need a strong and a state that has capacity in the fields that the state should operate in. And I think the key thing to understand is the frontier. And this is where I think the Thatcher government just got its theory wrong, is that there are frontiers that matter, and are partly theoretical, but partly practical. If something is a natural monopoly, and it's an essential service like water, it's essential need, the state should just do it. The three things that you have, if you don't understand that, is that you drive the incentives wrong because a private entity sweats the assets. It's not, the service ethic matters. I think that was, again, something which we slightly lost. The profit motive for the private sector, the service ethic for the public sector. The purpose of a water company is to provide water to the citizens, and it's nothing else. And once you start having, to put it crudely, spivs and bankers loading debt, using these organisations' debt mules, playing pass the parcel with it, and you're offshoring profits, then you're into something which, to be fair, because the left can be brutal about Thatcher, but I've never doubted her innate patriotism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think where we get to now, particularly with the luxury of hindsight, is just a whole series of unintended consequences on the capitalist side, particularly on this overreach. I can't imagine even Keith Joseph would look at Thames Water now and say that's been a success.
No, absolutely. But you see, I think there's a sort of third force here that didn't work, and where she did fail, though goodness knows nobody else has succeeded. Because as well as the state, what you call the state, and the private sector, there is local.
Mm-hmm.
And there were local water boards, actually.
Yeah.
And gas boards.
Mm.
And she was never able to visualize how best to do this, because most of local government, urban local government, was against her.
Mm.
And also most local government spending was in fact central government spending, simply siphoned into local government, and duties imposed upon local government by the centre.
Mm.
So we were never in a situation. The social market phrase was often strongly associated with Germany, which of course is well, she didn't like Germany, but which was also a problem. But but it's a federal republic, and the Länder make a massive amount of difference in Germany.
Mm.
It's a completely different way of doing things, and therefore, for example, you can have very successful, which I think Germany basically does, devolved health service, where they really are different in each place. And instead of saying, postcode lottery, probably a good thing.
Mm.
You've got and even banking did that, though I'm not sure that's so successful in Germany. So she could never break through into Thatcherizing or best employing local government to achieve a sort of third way. And there were a few Tory councils which were very innovative and pretty effective, like Wandsworth or something like that, in London, Westminster. But she never could. And remember that her biggest, most unpopular big policy, the poll tax, its intention was to return power to local electorates, because if their poll tax went up too much, they would vote against the people who put it up. And so the people who came in would put it down. And for all sorts of reasons, that didn't work. But you can see what she was wrestling with.
Yes.
So I don't think she thought, free market capitalism can run riot on everything and that's all going to be fine. I don't think that is what she thought. But she sometimes wasn't very good at understanding institutions, and she didn't have an instinctive like of local government, partly because how her father had been treated in local government in Grantham. And she also, which people do forget this very much, people thought they wanted the poll tax because they hated the rates, the previous system. So politically, she was fighting to change the rates, which were so unpopular, particularly with potential Tory voters, and produce something more rational. So these are sort of one of the great ironies of the politics of her period.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's fascinating, your insights on local government there, because it's some of the most intelligent critiques of Thatcherism are from the right. Of course, Roger Scruton would criticise Thatcherism for being deracinated, disconnected, and not rooted. So it wasn't local. And actually, if we're proper conservatives, social conservatives, we should be concerned with this. And I think it's a valid point, because actually the Thatcher government had what ended up being a very, very antagonistic relationship with the big cities and the GLC and the People's Republic of South Yorkshire and all the rest of it. So her instinct was to rate, cap and control. And Charles is quite right that the bulk of the spending was, Whitehall fetters and outsources its duties to local government. So it's not proper local government in the French sense. You don't have a mayor with power, and you can't really be different. So yes, we didn't actually have, there was no localism. There was no, that model, again, I think was just a failure. It was antagonistic. But the one thing I would bring up there, because I think it's, and I'm bringing it up on the credit side, actually, funnily enough, is that it's not talked about enough in the discourse about what the Thatcher government achieved or didn't achieve. Because I think on deindustrialisation, trade, housing, I think it was broadly disastrous in hindsight. But on local government, there is something that's there, which is not, which I say is not talked about enough, which is urban development corporations. Yeah, the UDCs as a model were very, very, very successful in Merseyside, on Tyneside, and then under Docklands, probably most prominent. The rate of investment, the change that happened in those urban areas by freeing them from the constraints of local government. There's no doubt at all. In fact, we like it as a model so much. It's our housing model. I think if you want to build some houses, you have to have UDCs for housing. So that sort of did work, and it was radical. There's no question it's on the credit side.
And I agree with that. And that, funny enough, was done by her and Michael Heseltine. And because they disliked one another so much, neither would agree that they actually shared this credit. And they sort of acted in quite a pragmatic way, in fact, to try and do these things. So yes, I mean, do you remember, all this time, as always in modern British governments, there's not enough money around. So how could you not confront this problem about, or try to control this problem about local government spending? Because ultimately it comes down on the British taxpayer. And there would be no appetite, though it might be better, if each local government was allowed to go bust. But it isn't. And under the British system, it couldn't be. And whereas in America, it can actually, it does quite often in some states. So what was she supposed to do? Is she couldn't let it exist by itself because of the financial consequences. She had to control the finances. And I think all that's very difficult, actually.
What should be clear to our viewers from the foregoing is that we're primarily focusing on the salience that the economy enjoyed in this period in British history. But of course, one question that people are asking today is people are inquiring more and more about the relationship between Thatcher and the culture. Do you think that Thatcher, Charles, I'll start with you, could have done more to reverse Britain's cultural and demographic revolution, much of which happened in the immediate post-war era? To pick 2 points, maybe bringing back the very meritocratic grammar schools that had been spitefully abolished by the egalitarian Labour government in the 1960s, and indeed, following Enoch Powell's advice, and of course she was a great admirer of Enoch Powell, and I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, even advised Ted Heath to go a little lighter on him than he in fact did after the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. She was a lifelong admirer of Powell. Could she have done more to reverse Britain's immigration experiment, post-war immigration experiment, such as it was by the 1980s? So grammar schools, social issues like that, and immigration.
On grammar schools, another of these good historical trick questions: who closed the most grammar schools? Margaret Thatcher, as education minister, not as and the reason for that was that she couldn't not close them except by individual review, because that's how the system worked, and Ted Heath wasn't prepared to change that. So she saved some, but most went. And the political problem with it was that because only about 18% of maximum of pupils at any one time went to grammar schools, most people, including most Tory voters, had an interest in comprehensivisation because they thought their children won't get into a grammar school.
Right, okay.
So they, suppose grammar schools had been 30%, I would guess, you would have had a very big voting constituency for grammar schools. But that 18% wasn't enough to carry it, even among Conservatives. And she did reform schools in a very good way of giving them more individual power over themselves, and in what I think is a bad way, which is a national curriculum.
Correct.
Yes, and the other thing was
immigration. I mean, she was an admirer of power.
Yes, and here I think it's important to bear in mind that there wasn't actually serious net migration in Margaret Thatcher's time, inward net immigration. She did, in fact, control it pretty strongly. And it only became a bit of an issue right at the end of her time, because when the end of the Cold War, people started to 89 onwards. But actually it was pretty well under control. She famously said in 1978, before she was Prime Minister, people don't want to be swamped. She was much attacked by the left of the party for saying it. But the trouble was Enoch Powell, his eloquence, and some people would say his extremism, terrified politicians off the subject. So he may even have achieved the opposite of what he intended by raising it, because it became sort of unsayable. Wasn't completely unsayable by her, and she always maintained it. And it's very interesting that the far right never got a look in her time. She squashed them electorally completely, where they were actually beginning to rise in the 1970s.
If I may just say one, one of the major points that Powell made in 1968 is that we had already, to some extent, piled up our own funeral pyre.
Yes.
This looks more and more vindicated by the day in Britain. We are being swamped, whether or not Thatcher would have liked us to have been swamped. Powell wasn't just urging for a break on numbers, he was urging for civilized reversal of what had already happened. She admired him. I don't think she was particularly squeamish about his, not just his restrictionism, but about his desire to reverse it. Why didn't she do that?
I would say that it wasn't civilized to reverse it, because in order to do it effectively in enough numbers, you would have had to kick people out, and that would not have been civilized. They had arrived by perfectly legitimate means. We're not talking about illegals here. And you couldn't and shouldn't do that. And in terms of the numbers, really the big numbers have come after that.
Right.
I mean, I think that is the case, factually the case.
What do you, Thatcher and the culture?
Yeah, very interesting. So first on the grammar schools is interesting. The history of it, Peter Hitchens written a rather good book on this and is quite an expert in it. I think the grammar schools were just crushed basically in the brutality of interest group politics. So, most Tory MPs weren't bothered about grammar schools. They sent their children to private schools. It didn't really concern them. And then it was a dispute. The grammar schools there was a split on the left between two different types of socialist. There was a sort of socialist that was more concerned with giving working class kids in Durham County the chance to get to the top. That was the Durham Education Committee for grammar schools. And then another type of socialist who said, we really don't like that very much. We might famously select for our children, but we don't really want. So it was just savage. It didn't have anyone backing it, really. It was very vulnerable. I think it's a real pity, personally. But on the very, very broad, because it's a very common criticism of Thatcher that she didn't arrest or even really stop, didn't even slow down the great liberalisation that you might say. If you British social attitudes, you look at liberalisation and it's just straight up. And it's true, she didn't stop it. And I think, the question is, could she have done? What could have been done? And actually her view, she was, pro gay rights, pro abortion. She was critical of extending easy divorces. So she was actually thoughtful, mixed, not entirely in one camp or the other. But I am sceptical when people say that she could have succeeded when all other Western leaders in all other places. I mean, this is just, you've got to be realistic. I'm not sure that would ever have happened. The interesting thing, and we might want to go here next, is a sort of more fundamental, visceral thing about nation statehood. And I think there, unfortunately, it's another unintended consequences thing. I think she started in the wrong place on Europe and gradually tried to grasp her way back from it.
We should say she was pro-joining the European market in 1975.
Yes, she campaigned in favour of joining the common market.
In favour of staying in it.
Staying in it,
correct.
Yes, staying in it. But was on the pro side, and it was regarded as a sensible trading bloc, and it was progress, and I think, and again, I feel terrible saying this in a way, but I think the better social conservative is Peter Shaw. Who is Peter Shaw? Peter Shaw is a Labour Eurosceptic, and the in that referendum, Harrison, the coalition who wanted to get out of Europe, leave Europe at that point, was Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Peter Shaw. So it was a cross, but at the time, actually, it was mainly left-wingers who saw that you couldn't implement the type of social democracy that these people profess to want if you're in the EU, because it just completely fetters you. And you almost feel, in retrospect, sorry for Mrs. Thatcher, because she being pro-European, pro-EU project. It was how do you get back from this? It ends up signing the Single European Act, and then the famous Bruges speech, and actually by the end saying we should leave. So, I think it's a real pity, because I think that from a cultural point of view, the nation state is the highest level of democracy you can have, and so I think that's the criticism.
She had this is right, but she had a big timing issue, because the 75 referendum was, I think, in April, and she became Conservative leader in February, and she couldn't reverse. Not that she really wanted to, but she was never a very enthusiastic European. And I found out, and put it in the book, that after she'd been supporting the Remain Stay-In campaign, she watched just before the vote. She watched the No campaign, what we would call Leave now, broadcast, and she said to her colleagues after she watched it, "That was marvellous. I agree with every word."
There you go.
But of course, it was completely out of fashion then, and nobody, very few people in her party were on the other side. A few were, but. And so she sort of stuck with that. And anyway, she didn't have the time, sort of bandwidth, as some people now say, to think this through at this point. She came in, there it was. But she immediately didn't like what she found. And she particularly disliked it about everything to do with money and what she called our money, which is, by the way, not just annoying for them because they want to have the money, but it offended, it was blasphemy against the European idea, because once that money is allocated, it's not our money in European theory, in normal European theology. It's Europe's money. And so by using that phrase, it was a blasphemy. And this led her gradually to a much more sceptical position. But the Single European Act, which William rightly mentioned, was sold to her, and she was naive about this, as being improving markets, which to some extent it did, and therefore helping, whereas its actual fundamental purpose was the withering away of the nation state. And she began to realize that. She didn't recognize that nearly enough at that time, 1985-6. She recognized it much more when Delors started to advocate the single European currency towards the end of the decade. And that's when she starts to get really angry from the Bruges speech, 1988.
And that's when she says that we have not...
This is her education.
Yes. And she says, just for viewers who don't know, she says, we have not dismantled the frontiers of the state at home only to have them reimposed at a European level.
Exactly.
That's right. No, I think that's right. But I think it's another example, a sad example of unintended consequences, because actually the British diplomats won the peace on the single market. Unfortunately, it wasn't a single market for services, which was our strongest area. It was for manufactured goods and agriculture, which was very good for the French and the Germans. But so having got it and having made it into which is what it is, a utopian project, but also a trade cartel, this country actually suffered from it. And I think if you just look at the trade figures, you start with that, with good intentions probably. Let's make it more vibrant, increase the volume of trade. You can argue for that, but then what happened? Well, the trade deficit, if you want to look at the Britain's trading relations with the rest of the EU as a bilateral point, our trade deficit just went up. The trade went up to the extent that when we got to Brexit, I kept on doing interviews saying, well, the EU is our biggest, most problematic trading partner. You've got 100 billion deficit, and Paddy O'Flynn and I were the only people in the country in 2019 arguing for more trade friction. So there you go. So it's just one of those things. I think it's another example of probably started in the wrong place, and then trying to recover but not really doing so. So it's retrospect, but
yes, no, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the thing is, you can only do a certain amount when you're prime minister, and she did much more than any other prime minister since the war. So she didn't do badly, but she didn't think, she thought less. She did care about social questions, but she thought less about them because she was so preoccupied with the economic ones. And similarly, she received, as it were, the acquis of the European project without ever really worshipping at the church. But it was another thing to walk out of the church. And she did end up, as you rightly say, favouring leave, but she actually never said that in public.
She told you privately, then?
She told me privately, and many people privately, but people advised her not to say it because by this time she left office, and,
quite well known,
and it would have been too much of an explosion of everything. And
However, before we get to Thatcher's legacy, gentlemen, obviously we've been sort of gesturing in the direction of her legacy throughout the course of the discussion, but I would like to ask you very briefly a question. It is of course possible in theory to reconcile free market economics with immigration restriction. Powell is an example of someone who did it. He was in many ways a Thatcherite avant la lettre. And of course, Thatcher herself, as I understand it, held restrictionist intuitions. But is it fair to say, Charles, that free market economics, particularly the kind that Thatcher advocated, sets in motion a whole host of secular trends that actually make it very difficult to deliver this policy in practice? The three that I would mention are deindustrialisation, which of course leads to a larger proportion of women in the workforce and therefore cratering native fertility. It's the second, an obsession with sort of GDP maximizing growth and a tendency to think of human beings as exchangeable, fungible units rather than full human persons. She may have not felt that herself, but in practical terms, did Thatcherism set in motion a whole series of secular trends that make it very difficult to control our borders and to be immigration restrictionists?
Well, all big changes in society have their losers and gainers. Mm-hmm. And you could say the same thing, roughly, for what you're saying, about the move from an agricultural society to an industrial, urban society. There were losers, and many of them rioted, and they were very unhappy, and some of them did very badly. But nobody would say that it shouldn't have happened, or very few people, only a few sort of like Archbishop Roy Williams or something would say that it shouldn't happen. It's almost beyond should question. It was going to happen.
Yeah.
And we got there first. And similarly, if you think about social cohesion and what people want, people will always lament that the supermarket killed the local shop, but they shopped at the supermarket. And what are you going to do about that? In fact, Mrs. Thatcher's father, when he was old, because he'd been a grocer, was very against the abolition of resale price maintenance, which kept up the prices in grocer shops and so on, to the disadvantage of the consumer and the advantage of the shopkeeper. And he could see that the business he had run would be killed by this age of supermarkets was coming in. But if you're a political leader, it's a bit like, I don't know, AI now, let's say. Something like that. You can't just say it has terrible effects. It's coming. And then you have to work out how to mitigate its bad effects and improve its good effects. So what surprises me about, though perhaps she asked for it in a way because she's not being very decided about things. What surprises me is how people can pin so much on Mrs. Thatcher that's sort of wicked when clearly I think her best defence is that she seriously engaged with the problems that confronted the country. And that's where, and got many of them right, but many of them wrong too. But the point is she did seriously engage, and she was a skillful enough politician to pursue this for many years. And that's what you absolutely don't have now. So you don't have proper engagement, you don't have proper policies, you don't have some proper work behind it, and you don't have the political skill to stay on top. So you actually can do almost nothing. Yeah. And that's what we've now had arguably for a very long time, but certainly since the Brexit referendum.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with some of that. I think Mrs. Thatcher was the arrow tip to an intellectual movement of the new right and free trade economics that was there, and it was mobilized politically by her and convened by her. I don't accept that some of these things are just inevitable. I maybe there's a quite paradox views, but I think that the idea, for instance, of global free trade and laissez-faire capitalism globally between China, I think that's highly utopian and very paradoxical. Actually, I think it's as utopian as the EU project. Well, but I don't buy that it is an inevitable necessity, and the deindustrialisation was necessary. There was a prioritisation of services in London and the South East, and the model ended up being you make a bit of money there, and we're a transfer union, and you shove a bit of money to Teesside. But but I also think that and I think Harrison, I think you were right in drawing attention to this, that people from my side of politics would say that, social liberalism and economic liberalism are two cheeks of the same backside. I think there is certainly truth in that. And I think some of the cultural problems that you get into are actually upstream of the economics. So Thatcher was really concerned with the economics and that was her focus, but actually really it's cultural. So once you start being indifferent to what is made where and by whom, and to who owns what, particularly at that point, then you end up in the mess we're in. If you don't care about who owns Rowntree's Macintosh and you don't care who owns Cadbury's or any of the other stuff, then it's all for sale. But to get back to my point, she was a better retailer than a builder.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, not completely untrue, but she did care. But the question was, she thought about all this a lot. But the question was, what can you do when you're not in a very powerful position? And in a way, this was very like her attitude to our relationship with the United States, not only on trade, but with everything, with defence. Of course, what she really liked was the idea when Britain was top nation. But since that wasn't going to happen, what's the next best way of doing it? And the answer is stick close to America.
Yeah.
And you do that in defence, and you also open up your country to American investment, which was very successful. And of course, that opens up America to British investment, which was also very successful. So there's a lot to be said for in this difficult time. But also, she's trying to express the problem which William's talking about. When she said that famous thing, there's no such thing as society, which is always hung around her neck, what she said was, there's no such thing as society. There are individual people and there are their families. And first they must provide for themselves and for the families. And from that, they can help others. So if you're a modern person, what she would say is, there's no such thing as society. And she made that little thing meaning a quote. In other words, don't blame it on somebody else. It matters. It truly matters, but it matters. It's your responsibility. It's not someone else over there that's doing it. That's what she was saying. And that's because she's a Christian and with a Methodist tradition. And I think she had a sort of ideal and somewhat unreal idea that Britain, and particularly England, had been a sort of good Christian society where people helped one another and made money, and a sort of Wesleyan way of looking at the world. And that's what she wanted. That's what she sort of harked back to. And also she wanted to create a modern version of it. So I think she's engaging with these questions more than is acknowledged.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. I think that must be right. But I think, and on the sort of ideology pragmatist question, I take that point as well about power. You've got to play it as it lays. You can't, wishful thinking might be useful in some ways, but you've got to, if your economic circumstances are this, you've got to acknowledge them. I get that. But I think, I just think they overreached it with global capitalist laissez-faire ideology, and I think we're paying the price now. And I don't think this is new at all, by the way. I think in a sense the Corn Laws, and I think my favourite Edwardian Tory, Birkenhead, gave a wonderful speech at Chatham about free trade against protection. He said, look, basically, to summarise, if we were to win, I am a free trader, but I don't believe we will, so I favour protection. And I think Birkenhead was right about that. And I think that's where we are. I think where I look now, and it's with privilege, but we have deindustrialised. We've got a major problem with the Midlands and the northern towns, and I think it would probably be cheaper and better to keep the factories open.
Just to close, gentlemen, so for a bit of context for viewers, Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark Thatcher, was, and I think is, a cosmopolitan businessman. Her father, as you've already alluded to, Charles, was a grocer as well as a lay Methodist preacher and a pretty fervent British patriot. Peregrine Woosthorne once said, as you know, and as you may know as well, that Margaret Thatcher set out to recreate a country in the image of her father and ended up creating one in the image of her son. Yeah. Starting with you, William, do you think that Peregrine Woosthorne was onto something?
Oh yes, yeah, I think he's onto something, and I think even the denser criticism was really from Lord Stockton about selling off the family silver. I think that's because I think that we're in a situation where we're looking at the country as a shop, and some would argue of necessity, but I think you can't sell everything. There's got to be a line.
Charles?
Well, I think the family silver was an interesting analogy because it was a wrong one. Because what you're saying there is the family's running out of money, so it's got to get some money. Whereas what you're doing when you privatize, particularly something that's competitive, is you're making it better capitalized. You're making it produce more goods or services better. So it's actually a creative thing. Perry Worthson's remark is brilliant, but it is unfair, because I think what you have to think of is what would have happened if somebody like Mrs. Thatcher hadn't come along. What you have to remember what Wilson, Callaghan, and Heath, all the rest of them, had failed to do, and how things were getting nowhere. And she had the courage and intelligence and political guile to make them get somewhere and produce something which, despite all the complaints, people don't really want to go back on, and from which the rest of the world learnt a great deal. So I'm absolutely accept all sorts of criticisms about her, but I think what concerns me to understand is her stature, because she was a proper, active, doing, reforming, and in that sense, successful and politically successful Prime Minister.
Gentlemen, it has been a very edifying, civilised conversation. Charles Moore, William Clouston, thank you both for joining me on the
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, very kind. Thank you.